Alrighty, so we're back, and at this point we've kind of gone through the baking of the normal map process, right? So we can kind of see in our shading workspace, right, that we've got the normal maps baked down. We can kind of see them right here, and we showed a couple of different ways that they work, right? In particular, you have to kind of make sure to go back into here, right, that kind of little kind of looks like a microwave or a briefcase, right? And that's where you can kind of change your rendering engine stuff, right? So we switched it to cycles, right? There's a little pull down here to cycles because that gives us, the baking controls down here. And we saw we could bake from multi-res if we wanted to. The only thing you have to, and I made a video for that, of course. But you could, of course, use the extrusion settings as well. So there's kind of a couple of different ways to bake normal maps down that have their own different uses. If you're not going to bake from multi-res, then you have to have at least two objects, right? Kind of your high res with the multi-resolution on, and then your low res without it on. That high res though can have a bunch of other objects, right? So you can bake several different objects into it, and that's kind of one of the cool things from it is baking from multi-resolution won't really do that properly, right? So there are some advantages to that sometimes. For us, because of the way we've been building the crab and it's really only two objects, it's just been all sculpting, multi-res will actually work pretty well. So it's kind of one of those things where often baking from multi-resolution will be faster and easier and produce a great normal map. But it's not appropriate in every circumstance. That's kind of why we did 3 videos on it, the different kind of ways to do it. Also, later on, I'll show you some more add-ons, right? Not this project, we're trying to keep it add-on free, or just add-ons that we could turn on that come with Blender. But there are a couple of free add-ons that are quite useful that are be cool to see later on in later projects. We'll see those later. So what I want to do is I want to start to teach you guys to see texture painting now, right? Because that's where we're really at. We've done a lot already for this crab. And now we want to start to get color on this model. And eventually we'll pose and we'll do a full lit and rendered scene. And, since we're down to a couple weeks left, we want to start to transition to that. So in this case, I'm going to just probably turn the visibility for my crab gear off. And, 4 for object mode, of course. I can click on this. And of course, we can see that there's our object selected. We can see that there's the material I created, right? In the other videos, you can these will have their own separate materials. You can kind of assign them new stuff, change the names. But you can even go down here, right? Remember that little kind of reddish sphere, right? And you can always make new materials from here, name them, assign them. Once you've created one, you can see there's usually a way to assign it to a mesh. Or even just kind of pick the different ones you want, right? That little pull down. And you can see the kind of the nodes here. And you can kind of see that we have the basic material, which is all of this stuff right here. But then we can kind of see that there's the actual texture that we created. And then there's the normal map node. Open that up again here. Whoops. There we go. And we can kind of see the little node network here, right? Of kind of all these little different connectors. And one of the things we've seen that's really cool is that Blender does that stuff quite easily. Remember, there's videos for all of that stuff in there. Now, at this point, though, we want to start to create some other textures, right? So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new texture for this guy. And then we'll kind of switch over to the painting tool set in a moment. But it'll be pretty easy just to assign it, make sure it's all connected right here. So remember, one of the things you can always do is you can always go over here and make a new image, right? So this is the shading viewport. You can see your viewport render here. You can see your material nodes and material controls here. And then this is really just your textures. So in this case, what I could do is I could just go new image, click on that, right? And remember, it brings this up. And what we can do is we can call this, say, crab body color. And we probably want to make it higher than 1024. So we'll just do 2048. As we go and do more stuff, we'll do even higher resolution textures, but it does kind of to a certain extent depend on how much your specific machine can handle this stuff, right? So 2048 by 2048 will be good. In this case, we can leave it blank for the generated type. And a 32 floating will always be a nicer quality texture, but it also is a bigger file size. So I tend to kind of reserve that a little more for like a bump map or normal map where you really can see some weirdness sometimes for that stuff, particularly bump maps. So for us, we'll just leave that off and just kind of have it create the default bit depth that Blender does. But we just want to create a new image. There we go. And we can see there's an image here. And once again, what we can do is we can go to Add, right? And we can go to Texture, right? So we go to this Add menu here, Texture. And what we do is we go to Image Texture. right? And it creates one of these nodes. So you can kind of see right here, it's just like this node, right? And what we could do is we can go, of course, you can create a new one from here. You can open if you want to find a texture you've already made somewhere else or had somewhere else. But in this case, I can click here, and there's the crab body color, right? So I can pick that, right? At this point, though, we want to plug this into the color, right? So just like with this guy, we kind of grab the yellow dot in the color section. And like our normal map, we just plug it into the channel we want it to be. Now, this is going to be our color map. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of grab that yellow dot, left-click drag on it, and plug it into base color. And there you can see we actually have that plugged in. So of course you could go and you could plug it in here, right? So you can always click on these dots to plug it in. But the actual node network in Blender is really, really easy to do. I always like to kind of make sure that these UVs will work a little better too. So I always kind of try to make sure to go in here to input UV map, kind of drop that in there, and you can just left click drag on this purple dot to vector, and that just makes sure that the proper UVs are lined up. So we grab UV map there. So there we go. And it just makes sure to properly use the UVs. Now in this case, our color is black, right? Because that's kind of the default color that it usually does. So what we need to do is we need to kind of do some flood paint stuff. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to switch to texture paint now, right? We've seen modeling, we've seen sculpting, UV editing, we've even started to see the shading workspace. But there's a texture paint workspace, right? And so we can click on that and go to texture space. And one of the things you'll notice here is that we actually have a 2D painting space if we need to do 2D painting, which we won't really need to do on the crab, but we'll definitely take advantage of this a little more on our hard surface modeling, our environment modeling. Some of you guys remember that from last year that we're here, right? So you have a full ability to do 2D painting as well as 3D painting. So in this case, I'm going to move the little bar here, right? Remember, if you just put your cursor over it to see those two like arrows, you can actually minimize that, right? So if you want more space for this, you can paint right here. Now in this case, you notice how we're not seeing the normal map? It's always a good idea to kind of go back up to here, right? Remember, we have the wireframe right here. We have regular shaded, and then this next one over is basically our textured, right? And that shows full Eevee. In fact, if you want to go back here, you can kind of go to there, and it's going to use Eevee anyways. But if you just want to make sure to turn on Eevee so you can turn on other things, like blooms, often pretty cool to have. We're probably not going to get anything high enough to really take advantage of that yet, but I kind of showed you on one of those other videos and like a little bit of stuff there, so we'll see this a little bit more later on. But you can actually kind of turn on things and see them actually in Eevee, which is really cool. In this case, I'm going to go to my little kind of red sphere, because that's our material, right? And you see there's the crab color body. You can see the normal map's got something plugged in as well, so you can kind of see the little arrows that show that something's got plugged in there. In fact, you can kind of open it up to see some of the controls, right? In this case, we've got some shininess, a lot of shininess on this guy right here, right? So what we want to do here is I'm going to turn down the specularity. So you see I can kind of grab that control slider, and we can bring the roughness up, and it makes it much more of a subtle kind of shininess, right? So you turn the specular down so it's less shiny. You turn the roughness up so it's pops a lot more. So this starts to give us kind of some of our basic stuff that we want to do, right? I can make my brackets go down a little smaller. Now, by default, because of some of the settings here, you might notice that your zoom doesn't really work, right? Scroll wheel will still do the zoom, so you can always use scroll wheel if you want to in this case. But you might find right mouse buttons not working for you. And that can be because, and this is always where it's a little tricky because of not being able to see all of the settings up here unless I move it over, right? What can happen is that you might have texture masks set stencil, right? Instead of, say, view plane. And you'll notice if I turn view plane on, the right mouse button is back, right? For zooming. So that is kind of one of those things where texture mask stencil can kind of override that because of the quick keys it uses to navigate through stencils. We're not going to quite look at that yet. We'll kind of take a look at that on later videos for this crab. But if you kind of don't want to have to worry about that, it's the texture mask stencil being on that's doing that, right? And of course, texture has stencil as well, and you'll see when we turn that stencil on. So it's the stencil that's actually kind of causing that because it uses some default quick keys that use the right mouse button. So you will notice when you have stencil on, you might need to use your scroll wheel for zoom or change the quick keys. But for right now, we're just going to say view plane on. But you'll notice texture and texture mask both have this. View plane is usually a good default unless you really want to use a stencil. And stencils are cool and powerful, and we'll see those particularly on our armor. But this one just does full color, and this one actually kind of is basically kind of like you're doing the stamp stuff that we did in previous classes, where it uses kind of the dark and light pixels to paint. So all that functionality, believe it or not, is actually inside of Blender, right? The only weak point in Blender right now for painting is actually the fact that it's not terribly easy to browse tons of textures. It's not terribly easy to work with layers and multi-channel painting. That's one of the things where there's a layers add-on that we'll see on later projects that's free. But I recommend BPainter if you've got $40 lying around, right? BPainter is just awesome. I'll briefly make a video for you guys just to see it, so you guys can see it and go, oh man, I think that's worth $40 to spend on it. It really, really takes the painting tools to the next level in Blender. What's great about Blender's painting tools, though, is the core actual tools for painting are all excellent, and Eevee as a real-time previewer is quite excellent as well. There's just a few other areas that you kind of maybe want to get some add-ons for, either free or especially BPainter add-on on. Now in this case, what I want to do is I want to, because this is really just going to be introduction, right? We're not going to go over tons and tons of stuff for this today, but I want to get it started. You'll see that you have your main painting brushes here. So we have all those strokes, controls, and stencils, and that's really kind of the workhorse. But you'll notice there's paint, there's soften, there's smear, there's clone, you have fill, and even masking features. So there's some kind of neat stuff here that we're going to see more as we go along. In this case, I want fill. So I'm going to click on the fill bucket. Now, remember the very, very top of kind of this area, right? It's kind of like our... I'm trying to think of what they actually call it. I mean, I think it's basically just their editors, right, in Blender. But we know we have our modifier there. We have our materials, our texture, lots of cool controls in here, even our rendering stuff. But that very top one is the screwdriver and wrench. If you click on that, that is actually your options for this brush, right? So you can see that you have the ability to control the strength, have the strength pressure on. Like we saw for sculpting, that's where you can turn unified strength off or on or off, right? And you can even pick your color, right? So I can go in here and I can click on the color here. And I think we're going to go with like more of a greenish color. And you see I can kind of click on it, and you have a slider to make it lighter, darker there. But then you can also just pick your color, right? So you can actually go in here and pick your color, make it a little darker if you wanted to. Probably a good idea to kind of do that for the base color. Click back on that, maybe make it a little brighter. So you do have some kind of neat controls here for how you want to control and play with that. But in this case, we've got the fill bucket on. And what we can do with that fill bucket is we can then basically click on the object and it fills it in. Now in this case, you notice how it filled in just what was visible. If I click actually in here, it'll fill the whole texture, right? So you can use the fill bucket either right on the model or right on the actual texture itself. Like so we said, this supports full 2D painting without having to flatten or unflatten like you did in Mudbox, right? So the actual core painting tools in Blender are quite excellent. It just needs a proper layer system, and that's where free add-ons or paid add-ons can really, really take Blender to the next level. So I wanted to kind of get you guys to see that a little bit. The fill bucket, kind of how you can create a texture. One of the things you want to keep in mind is you'll see right up here, image, right? So there's that little asterisk next to it. So if you click on image here, this is where you can go to save, or even save as, so we can create it for our first time. So I can kind of just, crab body color PNG. All right, we'll save the image as, there we go. And now we've got the texture created. So fill bucket's really neat. And fill bucket will actually work on specifically masked faces, which is really, really neat, right? So that's kind of one of those things where, if I was to go to 3 for face mode, right? And I was to go in here and I was just, double click on a face in between those edges, up arrow to grow selection, right? You see we can go to kind of here. There we go. And you'll see some other tools come up with that as well. But what we can do is we can hit 8 to go back to texture mode, because this is the other important thing as well, right? Remember, there's edit modes, right? We know object mode is 4. Edit mode is technically 1, but 2 and 3, of course, 1, 2, and 3 do edge, face, vertex edit modes. Sculpt mode is 5. You'll notice, though, there is a texture paint one that has a quick key 8. So what you can do is you can go right back to texture paint mode, and you see this little kind of box right here, paint mask. If we click on that, you'll notice that it only shows what was selected, right? And what's really cool about that is with that paint bucket, if I like picked a much darker kind of green, right, and I did fill bucket, it only fills that, which is really, really cool. So your fill bucket actually can work on what's selected, right? This little paint mask feature is actually quite neat. You guys don't need to use it right now, right? I'm going to undo this technically. And the nice thing is you can turn that off, and you see if you go back to 3, that face is still selected. So you can kind of leave that selection there, go back to texture paint mode, do all your texture painting, and then kind of turn this off and on when you need to, and it just uses whatever the selection currently is. So kind of neat, right? Kind of neat. I like to make sure to kind of show that off to you guys. And we'll take advantage of it more as we go on as well. I don't think we're really going to need it much on this project, the masking, but the fill bucket with selections is actually quite neat in Mudbox. So kind of wanted to get that started there. And now what I want to do is I just want to do a little bit of color painting on this guy, right? So in texture paint mode, we're going to go back to our draw brush, right? You see I've kind of minimized kind of this area right there. And I've gone back to the draw brush, right? Now, in this case, I want to kind of go back to that green. One of the things you'll notice, though, is there is, if you click on your color here, right, there is an eyedropper, so you can always kind of eyedrop the color you want there, right, which is always cool. If you're really, really wanting to see it full flat shaded, right, maybe one of those things where you just go and kind of go to here, right, maybe turn that to flat, and then when you do your color picker here, right, you'll see it'll get the exact color. In this case, actually, it looks like it was doing that fine. I know in previous versions it could be a little weird, so just keep that in mind that you might, that when you click on this, you do have your color picker there to sample that color. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go with a lighter, much kind of lighter green there. There we go. So I want a lighter color there. And in this case, I don't really have, I'm using a mouse instead of a Wacom pen, but this can be cool to have on when using that, but I want that strength to be quite low. So I'm going to turn the strength for this draw brush down quite low. I also like to make sure to, I'll kind of minimize this over a little more. And you might even just use it here too. Like you'll see all the controls are here as well. So if you're having a hard time seeing all this stuff because my monitor that I'm working on from school is quite small, you know, they don't have my teacher station fixed yet with the bigger monitor. So like if you're on a bigger monitor, you see everything, it's always there. But remember, if you're on the wrench and the screwdriver, you're actually going to have all these controls right here too. So all this stuff is still going to be here. Stroke, texture, texture mask, color palette, radius and strength and all that stuff. And you can go to fall off here. And I usually like to just click on the pull down and go to smoother so that the actual fall off of this will be softer, right? So I always like to make sure my my fall off is smoother. It would be up here if you could actually see the whole thing, right? And what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to kind of go underneath it. And what we can start to do is, and I think it's painting black, unfortunately. So let's click on this one, and let's actually click on that one really quick. Let's see, color palette. And if you need to also, remember, if you have this color palette here, one of the things you can do is you can actually add a new color to there. In this case, it's using those, so we can swap them, right? And you see we can kind of have that color saved there. And now you'll see when I go in here and I properly paint this, you see I can kind of put a lighter color underneath the crab, but it's got this nice kind of softness to it, right? Be careful, right, when you're painting. If you kind of get too much to the edge here, it'll kind of create some artifacting. You can, of course, paint over that. That's the great thing about this image. But remember, 3D projection painting, just like sculpting, you're doing it from the view itself, right? So kind of when you get polygons that are facing away from the view, it'll kind of stretch and kind of have this like glancing angle effect. So painting, regardless of whatever 3D projection painting you're doing, you always have to be a little bit careful when the polygons start to face away from the camera. But you'll see we can get in here and we can kind of do some nice little coloring here, right? And sometimes if I want it to look a little lighter underneath, I can go, since the Eevee's on, I can go into here. And you can actually turn up the strength, right? and it maxes out at 2, but you can type in a higher number. So if I want 4 to really see this well temporarily, we could do that, right? And you see with a low strength for our brush and kind of that little nice kind of smoother fall off, we get this nice kind of fading, and we can just kind of build up some basic color on this model, right? And so this really is going to allow us to start to paint color on this model. Now you'll notice it's actually showing up in the textures, right? Because remember, this is a 2D picture, right? We created a PNG just like our normal map. This is why we UV unwrap, so that it knows how to take the pixels that you're painting and apply them to the model. But that actual texture is a two-dimensional picture, right? It's a two-dimensional collection of pixels. The nice thing is you can go in here and paint if you wanted to as well. And we'll take advantage of that a little more as we go along. I start to paint a little bit of color here. Right? Remember, just be a little careful when you're kind of getting to the edges here, right? But one of the great things is you'll notice whole different areas, right? One of the great things is that all those seams we created for our UVs, this projection painting goes right over those, right? So remember how there's kind of a seam kind of right here on the bottom of those legs? And you notice how it's painting it over that perfectly? So remember, that's actually one of those things that's great about 3D projection painting. It's kind of like your... it's kind of like a projector, right? Where that projector projects light onto a two-dimensional screen, right? Particularly if you're in classes that have that, right? So it's really just projecting those pixels from the camera and from your brush right onto this. But the great thing is that because you're projection painting, it goes over seams like they're not there, making it very easy to paint right on the model, the exact colors you want, and not have to worry about any seaming issues, right? You notice I'm being careful with a small brush size though, right? My brush size is pretty small. Remember the bracket keys, just like for sculpting, they can make your brush bigger or smaller. And we can just slowly start to get a bit of color in here, kind of in these areas. And you see how sometimes it can project a little bit weird, right? So that's where you might just go back. We'll add this color. I really kind of want that other color, so let's go back to color palettes. Grab that guy, and man, that really still looks like it's the same color. It shouldn't be though. What's happening there? That, like I said, that though sometimes can be why maybe you switch back to this one for flat shade, right? And then if you go into here, color picker, so that picks that darker color. There's actually a cool quick key in B Painter that actually has that set up to already do that, which is so cool. So there's some neat stuff that B Painter offers. But you do want to be careful to kind of grab the exact color. The nice thing though is you can add these colors in your palette so you don't have to keep sampling them, right? So if you do kind of get that area where it starts to stretch or overpaint, you can always come back in and kind of repaint that section a little bit. And you notice how you can kind of go back and forth between these colors as we do some painting here. And that's really what I just wanted to kind of get you guys started to see on this video, is that we can start to paint, right? And we get some cool texturing in here as we go along. You just have to be careful of how it's going to projection paint, right? And sometimes get like slight bits like that, just if you're not painting at a careful angle. But like I said before, you can kind of always come back in here and just kind of repaint them out, right? But I really wanted to get you guys started with that a little bit, just to kind of see how this works. But the overall projection painting tools work quite well and are quite excellent. And it's just like any 3D projection painting, you have to be a little bit careful of the view you're painting at, right? Because it can just do that. And that's true if it's in Mudbox or Mari or anything else like that, right? But you can see that we have some cool painting features kind of already built into this. I think that'll be a great place to stop. We'll kind of keep coming back and doing some more. So I'm going to go back up to image here, save, right? And you see there's a quick keys for that. So Alt-S, there we can go save it. And then I can just save that scene as well. Believe it or not, Blender can actually save these things internally, so you don't have to keep saving those textures. I don't want to quite talk about that yet, just because I wanted to make sure you guys understand how to create your own textures and paint them. But this one is going to be a good little intro video into texture painting. And we'll keep doing some more and adding some more stuff as we go along. All right, so I'll stop that.